Case 1. The Toy Box Killer, David Parker Ray. The desert outside Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, is quiet in a way that can feel endless. It stretches for miles, swallowing sound, hiding secrets beneath its stillness. That isolation is exactly what made it the perfect place for David Parker Ray. To neighbors, Ray appeared unremarkable, just another man living on the edge of town. But behind the closed doors of a modest trailer, investigators would later uncover one of the most methodically constructed torture environments in modern criminal history. When authorities first entered the trailer, nothing immediately screamed chaos. There was no sign of struggle in the traditional sense. No overturned furniture, no scattered evidence. Instead, what they found was something far more disturbing: order. The trailer had been engineered. Chains, restraints, and mechanical devices were carefully positioned with intent. Every object had a purpose. Every detail suggested planning, repetition, and experience. This was not the work of a man acting on impulse. This was someone who had refined his methods over time. But the most chilling discovery wasn't visual, it was auditory. Investigators recovered audio recordings made by Ray. On these tapes, he calmly described what would happen to his victims, outlining procedures with a detached, almost instructional tone. The recordings weren't chaotic or emotional, they were structured, rehearsed, and terrifyingly precise. For detectives, this created a unique psychological burden. They were not only reconstructing crimes, they were being guided through them by the perpetrator himself. As the investigation expanded, authorities struggled with a lack of physical evidence tied to specific victims. There were no confirmed body counts that matched the scale of what the trailer suggested. This led to a haunting possibility that many victims had disappeared without ever being identified. The uncertainty became its own form of trauma. Detectives assigned to the case reported difficulty sleeping. Some found themselves replaying the audio recordings long after leaving the evidence room. Others described a lingering sense of unease, not just from what had been discovered, but from what might never be known. Ray was eventually arrested, but he died before standing full trial. His death closed the door on countless unanswered questions, leaving investigators with fragments instead of closure. In the end, the case didn't just haunt because of what was proven, it lingered because of what was missing. And for the detectives who walked through that trailer, the silence left behind was louder than anything they had heard inside it. Case 2. The Toolbox Killers, a recording no one could forget. In late 1970s California, a series of disappearances began to unsettle investigators. Young girls were vanishing, often in broad daylight, leaving behind little more than confusion and fear. The suspects would eventually be identified as Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, two men whose crimes would become some of the most psychologically devastating ever documented. At first, the investigation moved slowly. There were no clear connections between the victims, no immediate forensic breakthroughs. It seemed like a series of isolated incidents, but patterns have a way of revealing themselves to those trained to look closely. Witness statements, timelines, and vehicle descriptions began to align. A van, ordinary, easily overlooked, became a central piece of the puzzle. When the suspects were finally apprehended, detectives expected to uncover evidence. What they didn't expect was the nature of it. Among the materials recovered was an audio recording, one that documented part of the crime itself. Listening to it became a necessary step in building the case, but it was also something many investigators were not prepared for. The recording captured the final moments of one victim in a way that was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to distance from. Unlike written reports or photographs, audio forces the listener into the moment. There is no buffer, no abstraction. Seasoned detectives, individuals who had spent decades in law enforcement, found themselves unable to endure the full tape. Some requested reassignment, others continued, but at a cost that lingered long after the case was closed. The psychological impact was profound. In court, the existence of the tape became a defining element of the prosecution. It demonstrated not only the brutality of the crimes, but the deliberate nature in which they were carried out. Yet even after conviction, the case remained difficult to discuss. The recording was never released publicly, and even today, it is referenced with caution. For those who heard it firsthand, it represents more than evidence. It represents a moment where professional detachment failed, and the reality of the crime became impossible to separate from the human experience of witnessing it. For the detectives involved, this was not just a case that was solved, it was a case that stayed with them, in ways they could never fully explain. Case 3. The Girl in the Box, Colleen Stan. Some cases are disturbing because of their violence. Others are disturbing because of their duration. The case of Colleen Stan was both. In 1977, Stan was hitchhiking through California when she accepted a ride from Cameron and Janice Hooker. To her, they appeared ordinary, a couple traveling with their child. There was nothing outwardly threatening, nothing that would justify fear, but that perception would change within minutes. Stan was abducted and taken to a remote location, where she would remain captive for 7 years. For investigators, this case would later challenge every assumption about control, survival, and human endurance. What made the case particularly difficult for detectives was the psychological manipulation involved. Stan was not held in chains at all times. Instead, she was controlled through fear, specifically the belief that a powerful organization was monitoring her every move. This fabricated system, known as the company, was entirely fictional, but to Stan, it was real enough to enforce compliance. When the case finally came to light years later, detectives struggled to process the complexity of what had occurred. This was not a straightforward kidnapping. It was a prolonged psychological captivity, built on deception, conditioning, and control. Interviews with Stan revealed details that were difficult to reconcile. She had, at times, been allowed limited freedoms, even interacting with others under supervision. Yet the psychological hold remained intact. For investigators, this raised unsettling questions. How does someone maintain control without constant physical force? How does fear become more powerful than restraints? The answers were not simple, and they left a lasting impression on those involved in the case. Detectives later described the investigation as mentally exhausting, not because of graphic evidence, but because of the realization that the human mind itself could be manipulated so completely. In the end, the perpetrators were brought to justice. But for those who worked the case, the true impact went beyond the courtroom. It reshaped their understanding of victimhood, survival, and control, and it left behind a quiet but persistent thought that not all prisons have walls.